Rewire your mind while you sleep. Napoleon Bonaparte slept 4 hours a night and conquered most of Europe. For 200 years, men have repeated that fact like it was a secret formula. Sleep less. Grind more. Sacrifice rest for ambition. But here is what they never tell you. Napoleon's empire collapsed. His army froze to death in Russia. His mind, by the end, was a wreck of paranoia and bad decisions made on no sleep at all. The 4-hour myth did not build his empire. It is what ended it. Sleep is not the enemy of discipline. Sleep is where discipline is made. While you are unconscious, your brain is not switched off. It is working. It is sorting through every threat you face that day, every fear, every flicker of weakness, and deciding what to keep and what to burn. The man who sleeps like an animal, who treats it as a weakness to be minimized, wakes up every single day slightly more fragile than the day before. The man who masters his sleep, who treats those 8 hours as training, wakes up sharper, calmer, and harder to break. This is the story of 10 men who understood that the night is not empty time. It is forge time. And if you can learn to control what happens in those dark hours, you can rebuild your mind from the inside out, one night at a time. Stick around to the end, because Inner Steel is built for men who want to train every part of themselves, including the parts that happen in the dark. If that is you, subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Every night, wars were being fought somewhere in his name, plagues were killing his people, and his own body was failing him with chronic illness that historians still debate the nature of. He had every reason to lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the day, rehearsing the disasters of tomorrow. He did not. Each night, before sleep took him, Marcus wrote. Not letters of state. Not military orders. He wrote to himself. Short, brutal reminders of what mattered and what didn't. Historians later compiled these private notes into what we now call meditations, but Marcus never intended them for an audience. They were a nightly ritual, a way of closing the account books of the mind before letting the body rest. He understood something that modern science would not prove for another 18 centuries. The mind cannot fully rest if it is still carrying unfinished business. Unprocessed anger, unresolved fear, unanswered questions, these do not disappear when you close your eyes. They follow you into the dark and corrupt the work your brain is trying to do. So Marcus emptied himself onto the page before he emptied himself onto the pillow. He asked himself what he had done badly, what he could forgive, what was actually his to control. By the time his head touched the cushion, there was nothing left rattling around in there. The Emperor of Rome went to sleep lighter than the poorest man in his streets, because he had done the one thing most men never bother to do. He took out the trash before bed instead of sleeping in the mess. This is the first lesson, and it is the foundation for everything else. You cannot rewire a mind that is still running. Before sleep can do its work, you have to stop doing yours. Seneca, the philosopher who advised emperors and eventually paid for it with his life, had a different nightly discipline, but it pointed at the same target. He would lie in the dark and conduct what he called an examination. Not a prayer. Not a wish list for tomorrow. An honest accounting of the day's actions, asked in the form of 3 questions. What bad habit have I cured today? What fault have I checked? In what am I better? Notice what is missing from that list. There is no self-flattery. There is no rehearsal of grievances against other people. Seneca was not interested in feeling good about himself before bed. He was interested in being accurate. This matters because the brain consolidates whatever story you hand it last. If the final story you tell yourself before sleep is one of victimhood, of everyone else's failures, of how unfair the day was, that is the story your subconscious spends the night reinforcing. You wake up the next morning having practiced being a victim for 8 hours straight, even though you were unconscious the whole time. Seneca refused to hand his mind that story. Every night, win or lose, he gave his brain something useful to work with. A flaw identified. A habit interrupted. A small improvement, named specifically, however minor. He wrote to a friend that this practice brought him a sleep more profound than any other man's, not because his days were easier, but because his nights were not haunted by half-finished arguments with himself. He had already had the argument, judged it fairly, and closed the file. If Seneca, a man who would eventually be forced to take his own life by an emperor he had once tutored, could find that kind of peace at night through honest self-examination, the excuse that your day was too stressful to sleep well starts to look very thin. Now picture Antarctica, 1915. Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, has just been crushed by pack ice. 28 men are stranded on a floating ice shelf with no radio, no hope of rescue, and a journey ahead of them that would require small boats crossing some of the most violent seas on Earth. Most leaders in that position would have spent every night awake, paralyzed by the math of their situation. Shackleton did something that seems almost insane given the circumstances. He protected sleep like it was rationed food, because in his mind, it was exactly that. He enforced a strict schedule even in the chaos of survival. Watches were rotated so that every man got real, uninterrupted sleep, not fragments. He personally checked that men were resting, not just lying down anxious in the dark. He understood, instinctively, something that modern sleep researchers would later confirm with data: a sleep-deprived mind cannot make good decisions, and on the ice, a single bad decision meant death. When his men eventually had to cross 800 miles of open ocean in a 22-foot lifeboat to reach help, Shackleton needed his crew sharp, not just willing. The men who survived that journey later credited their captain's obsession with rest as one of the quiet reasons they made it home alive. A panicked, sleepless crew makes panicked, sleepless choices. A rested crew, even a terrified one, can still think. This is the part men miss when they treat sleep as optional under pressure. The more dangerous your situation, the more critical your rest becomes, not the less. Shackleton did not survive Antarctica by sacrificing sleep for grit. He survived because he understood that grit without sleep is just a countdown to collapse. Every man watching this has his own version of pack ice. A deadline. A crisis. A problem that seems to demand every waking hour, and then some. Before you sacrifice the one thing that keeps your mind functional, ask whether you are actually solving the problem, or just performing suffering for an audience of nobody. Theodore Roosevelt built one of the most relentless public images in American history. War hero, police commissioner, governor, president, explorer. The kind of man who seemed engineered for nonstop motion. But Roosevelt's private letters reveal something his public legend conveniently leaves out. He guarded his nights with the same intensity he brought to everything else, and when he failed to, he paid for it badly. After the death of his first wife and his mother on the same day, in the same house, Roosevelt did not collapse publicly. He went west, to the Dakota Badlands, and ran a ranch. What almost nobody mentions is how disordered his sleep became during that period of grief, how he would ride for exhausting stretches partly to force his body into the kind of sleep his mind would not surrender willingly. He learned from that period something he carried for the rest of his life. Grief, untreated, will sabotage your nights indefinitely. You cannot outrun emotional pain by staying busy enough to collapse from exhaustion each night. That is not rest. That is just delay with extra steps. Eventually the debt comes due. Later in life, even as president carrying the weight of a growing nation, Roosevelt built fierce boundaries around his sleep. He would retreat, he would protect blocks of true rest, because he had already learned the cost of treating sleep as a problem to be muscled through rather than a system to be respected. The lesson sits uncomfortably with men who pride themselves on pushing through anything. You cannot push through sleep deprivation forever. You can only borrow against tomorrow's mind, and eventually, like any loan, it gets called in, usually at the worst possible time. Nikola Tesla is remembered as a man who barely slept, working through the night by candlelight, fueled by obsession alone. The myth makes good copy. It is also misleading in a way that has damaged countless ambitious men who tried to imitate it. Tesla did work brutal hours during intense periods of invention. But those close to him described something the myth leaves out. Tesla also experienced what colleagues described as cycles of complete physical and mental collapse, periods where his body simply forced him into extended, sometimes days-long recovery, because he had ignored its warnings for too long. In his later years, isolated and increasingly erratic in his habits, Tesla's eccentricities deepened. Historians and biographers have long noted the toll his irregular, sleep-starved lifestyle took on his health and his relationships, even as his genius remained undeniable. The brilliance was real. So was the price. Compare this to his early years, when Tesla was at his most productive, developing his foundational work on alternating current. Those who worked alongside him in that period describe long hours, yes, but also a man who, in his prime working years, still understood the value of rest cycles before the later erosion took hold. The tragedy of Tesla is not that he worked hard. It is that the legend stripped out the cost and kept only the genius, and generations of men since have tried to copy the sleeplessness while ignoring that even Tesla's own body eventually presented the bill. If you find yourself proud of how little you sleep, ask whether you are building something, or whether you are just running the same experiment that left one of history's greatest minds isolated, erratic, and alone at the end. Florence Nightingale changed the entire field of nursing not through reckless self-sacrifice but through obsessive attention to environment, and that obsession extended directly to sleep, both her patients and her own. During the Crimean War, Nightingale noticed something that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. Soldiers in wards with proper ventilation, quiet, and protected rest periods recovered at dramatically different rates than soldiers in chaotic, sleepless conditions. She fought administrators, military bureaucracy, and entrenched medical opinion to enforce something as simple as quiet hours and clean air, because she had observed with her own eyes that a body fighting to heal cannot do so while the mind is denied real rest. What is less discussed is how she treated her own collapse. After years of relentless work in Crimea, Nightingale returned to England seriously ill, and spent much of the rest of her life managing chronic health problems, many of which biographers connect to the sustained physical and mental toll of those unsleeping years at the front. She became, in a strange twist, a living case study in her own thesis. The woman who proved that rest determines recovery became proof of what happens when you ignore that lesson for yourself while applying it to everyone else. In her later, more limited years, Nightingale shifted her relentless energy into writing and reform from a controlled environment, finally applying to her own life the same principle she had spent a war proving on behalf of others. Protect the conditions for rest, and the body and mind can do what they are built to do. Her career is a complete argument in two halves. The first half proves that sleep determines healing. The second half proves what happens to even the most disciplined mind when that lesson is not applied to yourself, and not just preached to others. Winston Churchill led Britain through its most dangerous hour, while the city of London burned nightly under the Blitz. He famously took an afternoon nap every single day, even during the most chaotic stretches of the war, and refused to let anyone schedule around it. Generals, aides, and visiting dignitaries learned to simply accept that the prime minister of a nation under existential threat would, every afternoon, disappear for an hour or more of real, uninterrupted sleep. Churchill described this habit not as indulgence but as a force multiplier. He believed, and said outright, that the nap allowed him to get what amounted to 1.5 days of productive thinking out of a single 24-hour period, because the second half of his day started fresh rather than running on the fumes of the first half. This was a man making decisions that would determine the survival of his country, decisions that could not afford to be made by a fatigued mind. And rather than treating that pressure as a reason to sleep less, he treated it as the exact reason he could not afford to. The stakes were why he protected his rest, not despite the stakes. There is a particular kind of man who believes that the busier and more important his work becomes, the more he is entitled to sacrifice sleep as proof of his seriousness. Churchill, steering a nation through the literal threat of invasion and nightly bombing, took the opposite position. The more critical the decisions, the more non-negotiable the rest required to make them well. He did not see sleep as time stolen from the war effort. He saw it as the maintenance required to keep fighting it at all. Sojourner Truth, born into slavery and later becoming one of the most powerful abolitionist voices in American history, endured decades of trauma that would have justified a lifetime of broken, haunted nights. She lost children to slavery's cruelty, endured violence, and spent years fighting a system designed to break exactly the kind of resolve she carried. What survivors of trauma, and the people who study them, consistently describe as a particular kind of nightly battle, the mind replaying the worst moments on a loop just as the body is trying to rest. This is not weakness. It is the nervous system doing what trauma trains it to do, treating darkness and stillness as dangerous because, for so long, they were. Truth's response, documented through her speeches and the accounts of those who knew her, was rooted in something she returned to constantly, an unshakable, declared faith that gave her a kind of nightly anchor. She spoke often of a directness with her God, an almost argumentative relationship where she brought her pain, her fury, her exhaustion, and laid it down explicitly rather than letting it circle unspoken in the dark. Whether or not you share her faith, the mechanism she was using has a name today. Externalizing the burden before sleep, naming it out loud or on paper, rather than letting it loop silently, measurably reduces the nervous system's nighttime vigilance. Truth did this through prayer. Marcus Aurelius did it through journaling. The form changes. The function is identical. You cannot rest a mind that is still guarding an unspoken wound. Sojourner Truth went on to deliver some of the most piercing public speeches in American history, decades into a life that had every reason to have broken her sleep permanently. She is proof that even a mind shaped by profound trauma can find a way to lay its burdens down at night, not through suppression, but through deliberate release. Now consider Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who beat Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole and, just as importantly, brought every single one of his men home alive. Scott's expedition, racing the same goal, ended in death for the entire Polar Party. The difference was not luck. It was preparation, and a huge, underappreciated part of that preparation was discipline around rest cycles in an environment where the sun barely sets or barely rises depending on the season, an environment that destroys the body's natural sense of day and night entirely. Amundsen built rigid schedules for his men regardless of what the Antarctic sky was doing. Meals, sleep, and work happened on a fixed clock, enforced without exception, because Amundsen understood that in a landscape with no natural day-night cues, the body will happily drift into total disorder unless something external holds the line. Scott's expedition, by contrast, suffered from inconsistent routines layered on top of inadequate supplies and poor route planning. Exhausted, disordered men made worse decisions at exactly the moments when sharp decisions were the only thing that could have saved them. This is a brutal, literal demonstration of a principle that applies just as much in a heated apartment in a city as it does on the polar ice. Your body does not care how busy your calendar looks. It runs on rhythm, and if you do not enforce that rhythm deliberately, your environment, your phone, your stress, your inconsistent hours, will enforce a worse one for you. Amundsen made it home a legend. Scott did not make it home at all. The schedule was not a minor detail in that outcome. It was close to the whole story. The final story belongs to David Goggins, a man who has built an entire public identity around suffering, suffering willingly, suffering on purpose, suffering past the point most men would consider reasonable. It would be easy to assume his approach to sleep matches that brutal reputation. It does not. And that is exactly the point. Goggins has spoken directly and repeatedly about the period in his life when he was running on almost no sleep, training obsessively, pushing his body through ultramarathons and extreme physical tests while sleeping a handful of hours a night for extended stretches. He does not describe that period as the source of his strength. He describes it, in his own words, as a period that nearly destroyed him physically, one that led to serious cardiac issues that put his life directly at risk. What gets lost in the highlight reels of his hardest workouts is the part of his story where he talks, openly, about learning to respect recovery as part of the discipline, not separate from it. He has been explicit that the relentless sleep deprivation of his hardest years was not the secret to his toughness. It was closer to a mistake he survived, one he speaks about specifically so other men do not repeat it, thinking it is the source of his edge. The man whose entire brand is built on the idea that the mind gives up before the body does, the man who coined the phrase about the cookie jar of past victories you draw on when everything hurts, is also a man who has stood in front of cameras and told people directly that ignoring your body's need for recovery nearly killed him. That is not a contradiction. That is the whole lesson. Toughness is not the absence of rest. Toughness is being disciplined enough to give your body and mind what they require, even when suffering through it would look more impressive to everyone watching. 10 different men and women. 10 different centuries, battles, ice fields, wars, and personal collapses. And underneath every single one of them sits the same exact mechanism. The mind cannot rebuild itself while it is still standing guard. Sleep is not time off from the war you are fighting. It is the only place where the rebuilding actually happens. Marcus Aurelius closed his mental accounts every single night before he allowed himself to rest. Seneca refused to hand his subconscious a story of self-pity to chew on for 8 hours. Shackleton protected his men's rest like it was rationed food because he knew exhausted minds make fatal choices. Roosevelt learned through grief that you cannot outrun pain by staying too exhausted to feel it. Tesla's genius came with a bill that his sleeplessness eventually presented in full. Nightingale proved with data that rest determines recovery, then became living proof of what happens when you ignore that proof yourself. Churchill treated his nap as a force multiplier precisely because the stakes were too high to think with a tired mind. Sojourner Truth showed that even trauma-soaked nights can be laid down, not suppressed, through deliberate release. Amundsen beat the pole and brought every man home because he respected rhythm in an environment built to destroy it. And Goggins, the hardest man most of you will ever watch on a screen, will tell you himself that the sleeplessness nearly killed him, and that real toughness includes the discipline to rest. You do not rewire your mind by punishing it into submission during the day and then collapsing unconscious at night out of sheer exhaustion. You rewire it deliberately. You close the account books like Marcus. You hand your subconscious something honest like Seneca. You protect the hours like Shackleton protected his crew. You build the rhythm like Amundsen, before the chaos builds a worse one for you. The night is not empty time. It never was. It is the forge. Every man on this list either understood that and used it, or ignored it and paid for the ignorance in collapse, illness, or death. The choice was always theirs. It is now yours. If this gave you something to think about tonight, that is exactly what Inner Steel is built for. Subscribe, because there is a lot more of this waiting for you. Close your eyes tonight like Marcus Aurelius closed his ledger. Nothing left unsaid. Nothing left unguarded. Let the forge do its work.